Good afternoon. My name is Andrés Velasco, and I have a little secret to tell you. I was born in 1960, so my teenage years, my teenage decade was the 1970s. In that decade, my country, Chile, went first through hyperinflation, then through an economic crisis, then the collapse of democracy, a coup, and then human rights violations, murder, torture, human disappearances. So I come from a generation of Chileans which was really shaped by two questions. Question number one was, why did that happen? Why did that happen in our country? Question number two, what do we do? What can we do to make sure it never happens again? When I was 12, I remember standing in line to buy groceries. That was the period of the government of Salvador Allende, which in Europe, most Europeans, most Americans think of as an unusual socialist experiment. Most people in Chile, most middle-class Chileans, remember it as the time when inflation went up and you had to stand in line to get toilet paper, to get cooking oil, to get rice. Those are hard times for many people. And in the end, what happened is that just like Ireland in that famous poem by Yeats, the center did not hold and things fell apart. When the coup came, it was not a surprise, but it had long been in the making. The country was split ideologically. People had one worldview, which was a closed system, or a different worldview, which is just as closed a system. People who didn't think like you became not simply your competitor, became your enemy. And that was bound to end badly, and it ended with a collapse of democracy. But, even though people might have expected or foreseen what was about to happen, the unspeakable violence of that coup was something that even people who were very involved in politics could not really anticipate or understand. I was 13 at the time of the coup, and I remember following my father to visit a neighbor on the morning of the coup. He was a very senior politician, and his name was being called over the airwaves, saying, "Come turn yourself in at a military base." And this man, who knew a lot about politics, said, "Well, I've done nothing wrong. I've done nothing wrong, so I will go turn myself in, and I'll be back for lunch." Of course, he did turn himself in, but he was not back for lunch. He was arrested, he was taken to a concentration camp where he spent months and then released only into exile. And that was more or less what happened to a lot of people in that period of time. My father was a law professor. He was a lawyer. So when these horrific human rights violations became known, he became the attorney to a lot of the victims, to a lot of the families. So as a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy, I began to know things I wasn't supposed to know about. I remember as a nosy kid just, being in my father's study and noticing an envelope and sort of just taking a peek and being shocked to find a picture of a woman whose thigh had been burned with a hammer and sickle, and that had been, burned with a hot iron by a military patrol, the same patrol that had taken her husband away in the middle of the night just a few days earlier. And, these were things that were hard to convey. I was in a school that was only a mile or so from that place. That's a place known to Chileans as Villa Grimaldi, a torture center, where in fact Chile's current president, Michelle Bachelet, was once held. And because of my family, because of what my father was doing, I knew what went on there. And I tried telling people, my classmates, people in school, and frankly, they didn't want to hear it. Maybe they couldn't hear it. And that was, the case for many people. Because, even under dictatorship, even under very dire circumstances, sometimes the truth is very disquieting, and people just carry on. People fall in love, they marry, they have kids, they worry about holding on to jobs, they worry about their bills. Life goes on. And I think that, in a sense, as much as naked and violent repression, is what makes dictatorships lasting, what makes dictatorships have some lasting power. And things get mixed. I knew of a man I knew of a man who was held at a military base in Viña, a beautiful town in Chile's central coast. And he was tortured. And as he was dragged outside between torture sessions, he would sometimes be able to look down the hill and he would see the beach in the middle of the summer. And he would see people there lying on the sand, kids kicking a football around. Talk about good and evil coexisting. I guess that's what Hannah Arendt meant when she talked about the banality of evil in Nazi Germany. Torturers go home to their kids. Other people who just lead normal lives go to the beach while abuses are going on just a few yards or a few miles away. My father, the man you see up there, was one of the many people who were courageous and spoke up. And if you spoke up, you often paid for it. I was also playing football myself in school one Friday afternoon when a friend came in breathlessly saying, your father's been arrested. We have no idea where he is. And in fact, we didn't know where he was for 3 days until we suddenly get a phone call of my father saying, I'm in Argentina. But remember, this was 1976. This was the Argentina which had just had a coup. It was one of the darkest days of the dictatorship in Argentina, and Chileans got shipped to Argentina after to die in the streets of Buenos Aires. And what saved my father was the intervention of the government of Venezuela, a Venezuela that was back then democratic. They, first of all, allowed him into the Venezuelan embassy and then shipped him out, went to Caracas, and he was safe. And the government of Venezuela back then was the friend of many victims of dictatorship in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Brazil. So many of us carry a very, very big debt of gratitude to Venezuelan democracy then. And it is a debt of gratitude that we should remember and we should underline today. When autocracy in Venezuela, when Chavista autocracy in Venezuela tramples upon democracy, imprisons dissidents like Leopoldo López, who spoke in this very same theater a while ago, and which has driven many thousands of Venezuelans out of the country. So in 1976, my family and I were forced out of Chile. We went to the United States, where my father got a job teaching law, as he had done in Chile. And my parents had to live with the uncertainty, the uncertainty of not knowing whether they would ever go back to their country. The parents' generation was the unlucky generation. My sister and I, on the other hand, after some difficult adjustment, then went and had the privilege of being educated at some very good schools in the US. In some sense, our generation was the lucky generation. And I should say that exile always lasts much longer than you think. I remember many a meeting of people of my parents' generation at our house in which they would argue and then they would get up with a vow. The vow is, by Christmas, the dictatorship would be over. But that was 1979, and Pinochet would hold on to power ruthlessly for another 10 years before being removed. And in the end, he was removed. And when the dictatorship went, and did not go with a bang, it went with a whimper. It went, in a very Chilean way. It went like that. People took a pencil, drew a line on a piece of paper, in this case a ballot, and voted a dictator out of office. We Chileans are very legalistic. We're probably the most legalistic of Latin Americans. We like our change to be institutional, usually, with a lot of paperwork involved. So that's what we did. And a dictator was voted out of office. I'm sure there are other cases in history, but to be honest with you, I can't think of any right now. It was a very unusual experience. And it was an experience that, of course, took some courage, because the opposition, to which by then I actively belonged, had to courageously contest that election, which is held under rules that the opposition itself had not written. And when you do that, you can be accused. You can be accused of legitimizing the rules. But in this case, it was the right choice, because you could compete under rules you did not make, but change the situation, stretch those rules beyond what is imaginable, put an end to dictatorship, bring in democracy. Now, did anybody here see a movie called No? It was nominated for an Oscar last year. Almost got it. Well, you saw it. you will know that the movie No was all about how this campaign was crafted. And there was a lot of disagreement inside people in the opposition because traditional politicians wanted to have a traditional campaign in which you took the dictatorship to task for its many horrific human rights violations. And of course we had to do that. But also there was something else to be done. Young people, many fresh from exile understood that there were other issues. One of them was that people were scared. People were scared not only of what might happen to them if they voted against the regime. They were also scared of the fact that, violence could return, economic dislocation could return. So you had to run a campaign which was reassuring, hence the symbol. It doesn't get anything more reassuring than that, right? Many colors, many ideas. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Reassurance, the promise of a different, better future won, and people voted no. And on the night of the triumph of the no, of the end of the dictatorship, many people, I was among them, marched down to downtown Santiago, and things happened which I will never forget. In fact, that's one of many pictures. A woman, in fact, gave a policeman a flower. And, there were women, men, people giving policemen, guarding the presidential palace, flowers. And, those were the pictures that made it to the press the next morning. Since then, many things have happened in Chile. I don't want to give you the sense that, it's been easy. Right after the plebiscite, I remember hearing a very senior analyst say, now comes the really hard part. And in many ways, it has. Chile elected 5 democratic presidents since then, including the first woman ever to be elected a president in Chile, in South America. The country has moved forward. The country today has 3 times the per capita income of any other country, of what we had many years ago. Indicators of human development by the UN have all moved up, but of course, big challenges remain. One of those challenges is that Chile remains a very unequal country. Public services are not what they should be. Discrimination still mars the landscape of daily life in Chile. But, I am confident. I am confident that even today, when Chile is again in a difficult political situation, when institutions are being questioned, when credibility of institutions is being questioned, and when polarization is again a threat, I am confident that Chile will keep moving forward. We paid a very dear political price for that division. We paid a very dear political price for that polarization, for that view of other Chileans as enemies. And I'm confident we will make changes and we will not again go that way. And the reason why I'm confident of that is not so much ideology, but simply the common sense, the solid common sense of many Chilean citizens. I was campaigning. I ran in a primary 2 years ago in Chile, and I had a conversation with a woman in a market like that one, in which I asked her, what do you think of candidates, of politicians who say, they have the answers to all of your problems and they will solve everything in 10 minutes, And she said, look, I'm 70 years old. I was a single mother. I had 3 kids. I had to work all my life, but, I got ahead. Things were hard. And when somebody comes and tells me that life is easy, I simply don't believe that person. I simply don't believe that politician. So it is that common sense that I think allowed Chile to use a pencil, to draw a line, and to end the dictatorship. And it is that pencil, it is that spirit that I'm sure will keep us moving and will strengthen our democracy in the future. Thank you very much.